Hi, welcome to the next instalment in academic reading and writing. These videos are, as you know, intended to help you submit and write your major research critique for the course. This video will introduce you to a little more of the marking and the idea behind the critique, and it will also introduce how methods are written. Of course, all the papers that you've received all have method sections. All papers are conducted upon a piece of research that has, by its very nature, methods. And reporting those methods clearly is an important part of reporting on research. To return, though, to the critique for a moment, an important thing to understand when you are critiquing a paper, anything for that matter, is not to confuse a critique with a criticism. We are not seeking to look for weaknesses and to pull the paper apart. Rather, we're seeking to evaluate a paper, look at its components, understand what it does well, maybe what it doesn't do well, but really just evaluate the paper from the perspective of what papers should be and what the paper is. And these videos are intended to help you do that. But before we get on with looking at that, let's think about what the rubric consists of for this piece of assessment. You probably already know that the rubric is broken into two parts, a conceptual part and a methodological part. So you have two critiques to conduct, really. The conceptual part, where you assess how the paper functions as a piece of writing. A piece of writing that should have a theoretical framework. Now, if you're not sure what that is, you need to return to one of the earlier pieces of this academic reading and writing material, in which I outline the basis of a theoretical framework. And I include a piece of reading from Lenneman to help you understand what a theoretical framework is and how they're formulated. But from the perspective of your rubric, these dot points are actually taken directly from the rubric. So these are the things that you really need to be writing on. In fact, my suggestion to you is that you just set these out as subheadings and answer them directly. So does your introduction in your paper adequately introduce the question or the problem? Does it do so by developing a background, provide you, the reader, that what you need to understand why the question is being asked in the first place? And for them to do that, they need to, of course, base their reasoning in the scientific literature and the research literature. And for that to happen, there needs to be some form of literature review. It doesn't need to be labelled separately as a literature review, but there does need to be some evaluation of the existing literature. Of course, if they're reviewing literature, there needs to be referencing in there. And then what they need to do in the course of this framework, in the course of evaluating the literature, reviewing the literature, they need to offer some kind of evidence, some support for the assertion that there is a gap in the research that they need to fill. And then they need to outline the question that they're asking and how they're testing it. Many papers will include hypotheses. Those ones are great. Many don't. So how does this sit up against the rubric? Well, you can see that part that I just went through just then sit up here in this first part of the conceptual critique. But of course there is a second component to the critique. As I mentioned already, there's the methodological component. The methodological component in which you assess how the piece of work was conducted. So really, rather than assessing how the writing is presented, here you are assessing the research as a piece of research, how it was conducted. And that's what we're going to cover today. So far in the videos, we've covered introductions and theoretical frameworks. We've covered referencing And in the lecture content of week 5, I have covered the necessary components for experimental design. This time, we talk about methods. But let's just take a second. If we're going to cover methods now, what will that do in terms of helping you address the rubric? Well, it's going to help you understand the structure of the method. So that's going to feed into your conceptual critique. What we covered in the experimental design lectures are these things. Issues around the number of participants and if there were participants eliminated. We've talked about the idea of sampling and sample bias earlier in the course. Also, these issues of non-experimental effects and control groups and treatment groups I talked about in the experimental design lectures. I also mentioned blinding and gave examples of how blinding might work. I've also talked quite a bit about how we select samples throughout the course. And really important, down the bottom here, I know that we've talked about replication scaling, the scale of replication, whether the scale at which replication was conducted matches the scale at which the question has been asked. But what about these 2 points here? First, the idea of demand characteristics and the question of ethics. Well, there's still more content to come. In the first few weeks back from the lecture break, there will be additional content that focuses on social research and survey design. And those lectures in particular will focus in part on these 2 elements. So keep your eyes open for that stuff. But back to our conceptual critique. Of course, research is conducted in a specific way, as is research writing. So when we look at the way that research writing is laid out, you'd be familiar with this basic structure to research papers. Introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. Sometimes discussions and conclusions are bundled together, and in some papers, I must admit I find it very confusing when this happens, the results of the discussion are bundled together. Either way, these 5 components are always present in one form or another. So far, as you know, we've covered theoretical frameworks, research questions, introductions, and I've also talked about referencing, its importance and how we do it. This time, we're going to discuss methods, not methods themselves, but rather the way that methods sections are written. So a method section in a paper, what does it do? Well, perhaps the answer to that question is obvious to you. The name methods implies that that section describes how a piece of research was conducted. And of course, that is exactly what it does. It explains how the data used in the study were generated. Now, beyond just simply describing how the data were collected themselves, that description also lets the reader interpret how the conduct of the experiment or the observational study may have impacted upon the results themselves. You know yourself that based upon the way that we measure things, or perhaps the way that we sample things, how we select individuals to be part of our study, or how we frame the question, all of those things affect the data that we end up with. And the methods need to be properly constructed to answer the very specific research questions we have. So a methods section does that. It provides that information, not just in a general way, but to allow the reader to understand exactly the nature of the results that will be presented subsequently, and for themselves be able to independently think through what impact those methods might have had on the resulting data. In some cases, it is the basis of subsequent work, a method section that is, can provide subsequent researchers with the methods for conducting their own work. Now, that's not academic misconduct. Rather, when we seek to replicate studies, the only way we can replicate them is by using the same methods. Using different methods means that the results are not comparable. So, a method section also provides a very useful basis for subsequent researchers. It provides a basis, if you like, to extend the study that has been conducted into subsequent pieces of work. A key element, though, to all method sections is that the method sections themselves provide a way for evaluating the validity, the reliability of a piece of research. And it is on you as the author to demonstrate that to the reader. Indeed, a great number of paper rejections and comments and criticisms made by reviewers when papers go out for peer review is around this issue here of what the method does do, or rather what it doesn't do well. Now, when we think about a method section, I often like to start, when I write a paper, I start with a method section because I tend to find they almost write themselves. The reason for that is that a method section is really just a description of what I did. And I know what I did because, well, I did it. And I did that, whatever it is, in a very specific order. I started by asking a question, thinking about a place or a species upon which I'd conduct that piece of work. Think about the sample, the population that is within that area. I might think about when it was going to be done, the piece of work, if maybe my species was dependent or responsive to timing. And then I'd go about, certainly if I was working in a national park, seeking approval to get the work done. So I'd think about these big issues first, and then progressively I would come down to the fine scale matters of sampling, conducting my sampling, using particular approaches to measurement. And I'd also be thinking about what those individual approaches involve in terms of impacting upon the data, and I'd be also trying to describe it in as clear a way as possible. Now, when we look at method sections, we see what the approach was to the research in that ideally chronological fashion. That's how great method sections are written, in a logical, temporal stream. You can see here behind me this table that outlines how a method section is normally presented. First with the overview, then the study design components themselves, and then, last of all, of course, because it's the last thing we do, and it generally constitutes the smallest time period involved, the smallest period involved in the overall work, the analyses that we conducted afterwards. You can see, hopefully, that there is a natural chronological order here. We can't conduct our analyses until we've collected our data. We can't collect our data until we have a clear set of sites, methods. We can't do that until we have a sampling method, and we don't have a sampling method until we've asked the question, thought about the population, and found where we're going to do it. So there is this natural order that presents itself to method sections. And as an author, you need to write in that order. A reader just finds it confusing otherwise. Now, do notice that there are two writing funnels at play here. One from the broad overview down to the specific analyses. But also within each of these components, the overview, study design, and analyses, there's a writing funnel again. So writing funnels from broad to narrow define our writing always in academic setting. So the overview. You've seen the content on the previous slide. The overview gives the reader the basic big picture elements to the study. Outlines where and what in big terms, what species, and then describes the big elements to the ecosystem perhaps that you're working with. It provides all the details for another researcher to come in and conduct maybe another piece of work in exactly the same place on the same species. So different questions could be asked perhaps of the same population. And of course, there needs to be this clear temporal narrative that I've described already. Key elements for you to understand about the study design. Remember, again, there is a temporal narrative to it. But what we tend to do is describe in a broader fashion, in a general way, what the experimental design or the setup was. How was this in principle conducted? And then we narrow down to the description of the individual components themselves. But there are a couple of other things for you to bear in mind. Perhaps up until now, you've written very successfully, you've written, say, school lab reports or reports in college or so on. Now, a key thing to understand is that academic writing differs quite substantially from those kind of reports. And one area in which that difference is quite clear is how methods are written. You should never include a list of equipment, for example. Never have dot points. Never have basically a recipe book. You are describing exactly what you did. And basic elements like the type of equipment you used, when it's just routine equipment, well, that doesn't come into it. And never, ever a list. One thing we tend to do, because as authors we publish into spaces, into journals, that has a knowledgeable readership, we make an assumption about that readership, and that readership has the same basic research skills that we have. They understand the basic elements that we understand. That's not to say, though, that we don't describe things in detail or that we don't include references in the method sections, because we do both of those things. In particular, you can see that we refer to papers in which perhaps the methods we're using were originally used. It helps by keeping the paper concise so that we're not just repeating a description of methods that's been described before. And it also acknowledges where perhaps where we've drawn our methods from as well. Again, this is not academic misconduct because we are properly recognising the source. Then we get to the point of data analyses. Of course, the data analyses need to be described in detail about how we did it, but also why. Why did we apply a particular type of analysis? And if there were assumptions associated with that analysis, how did we ensure that our data met those assumptions? Also, we need to be specific about what type of software we used. Now, you might think that that's a strange thing to report, but software also has authors. People program those things, and they need to be appropriately recognised too. One thing in here that we definitely report is the significance level that we used. The reason for that is that it's appropriate reporting of the analytical procedure. One thing that we don't report, though, is this entire idea of how the null hypothesis significance testing process operates. What we tend to do as researchers is assume that other researchers have done a first-year stats course before, and they understand the idea of a null hypothesis test. Now, there is a condition here. If your paper in particular asks a question that requires some specific level of significance, perhaps it challenges an existing idea around the way that null hypothesis testing is conducted, well, then of course you do need to describe something of the null hypothesis process, but ordinarily we leave that out. So a method section is structured in a particular way. Things that we try to do are present the methods in a very clear structured fashion, in a chronological way, such that the theoretical framework that was established in the introduction follows through into our methods section. Our methods section, of course, from that point of view, needs to clearly be relevant to the theoretical framework and the research question that we asked in the introduction. If it does not do that, then it is completely inadequate. If it outlines methods, for example, that don't go anywhere near answering our research question, the question you should be asking is, what the heck are they doing there? Why is the author describing things that are not relevant to the research question? And you need to ask the same thing of your own writing. So a method section needs to recognise it needs to be written as part of a whole. Obviously, it's part of a continuing narrative within a paper. It needs to continue the narrative established in the introduction. Of course, on its own, it needs to properly justify the methods that are applied. Parts of method sections are not just method, rather they are methodology. Now, those two words are different things. Please, when you write reports and papers as part of university, don't call your method section a methodology, because those two things are different. A method section describes how a piece of work was conducted. A methodology is the reasoning behind an interrogation of the basis of a method section. So perhaps a study of the methods. So a method section not only outlines the methods, but often it includes methodology, an explanation of the why and implications of the methods themselves. It does so perhaps with literature. And if there are assumptions associated with the methods applied, they need to be clearly stated. So that's what a method section does, but also there are components that a method section should avoid. There shouldn't be a list of materials and inclusions of things like dot-pointed lists. Well, that's a big no-no. In the past, when I've had students write papers for this course, I've deducted 3 marks immediately if I saw any dot points. One thing method sections shouldn't do is go into too much detail, especially when existing descriptions of methods are already there. A method section does need to provide all the detail necessary to repeat a piece of work, but if those methods are described elsewhere, rely on that, use that to make your work, make your writing more concise. Ask that question of the paper that you're reading for this course, and think about how we might, if we were to write about the work we did on Black Mountain, how we might use a reference to Pook and Moore to describe what we did. Now, an important point here is that it is simply not enough to say that we adopted the survey method described by Pook and Moore. Rather, we would do that and then in the next sentence or sentences describe in brief what exactly we did without going into all of the detail that Pook and Moore did for us. All right, well, that is an introduction, quick, to method sections. Back to the rubric for your assignment then. What do you need to do? Well, remember, up to this point in time, you have thought about the framework within the introduction. Now, when you read the method section, read it from a conceptual point of view at least, read it to understand what was done, or rather what is written there, and whether it supports the conceptual framework laid out in the introduction. So does the writing, first of all, in the method section support that framework? And second, do the methods that the authors describe support that framework as well?